when, in the words of our speaker tonight, miners seized an industry. Not only seized, but also mined, marketed, and delivered 10% of the anthracite coal sold in the country in the decades prior to World War II. Who knew? In our programs this year, we've looked back 80 to 100 years to a time of vibrant social ferment, both left and right, in our country. These were decades when national legal recognition and significant governmental enforcement of worker rights and organization were non-existent. Not that such rights are fully accessible to workers today. We focused on how working people's history can be unearthed years later to help us continue the struggle today. Let me get this thing off my screen. There. Historian, writer, and labor activist Mitch Troutman will be our guide tonight. Mitch will introduce us to his ancestors and other miners, as well as the women, children, storekeepers, truckers, and priests who participated in taking over and then running abandoned coal mines. Mitch's forthcoming book, published by 10 Speed Press, is entitled The Bootleg Coal Rebellion: The Pennsylvania Miners Who Seized an Industry, 1925 to 1942. I've seen a plate copy of his book. It's a revelation and an inspiration. Tonight's Battle of Homestead Foundation program organizer is Maura Bainbridge, who will moderate the discussion. Following Mitch's presentation, there will be a question and answer period. And as Suzanne has advised you, please write out your questions to the speakers and post them on the chat. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best in the time allotted. Let me briefly tell you about the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Our founders, about 25 years ago, were of course inspired by a dramatic labor contract. Only 130 years ago now, the 1892 Battle of Homestead, PA. The whole nation's eyes back then in 1892 were on this thriving industrial town 12 miles downriver from Pittsburgh. The strong union, the amalgamated in Homestead, had built powerful alliances within the workforce, the community, and the region. They knew they had to defend their labor contract and its high compensation and work standards. Their employer, the Carnegie Steel Company, a monopoly steel coal empire controlled by Andrew Carnegie and his henchman Henry Clay Frick, was determined to cut wages and break the union. When the contract expired, Frick built an 8-foot-high wall around the mill, locked out the workers, and launched plans to import scab labor. An epic struggle ensued, which, despite extraordinary resistance and militance by the workers and their allies, ultimately resulted in defeat for the Union. That's mostly because 8,000 state militia were sent in 2 weeks later by the governor after the battle to occupy the mill and to protect scab later. Before that, no one dared try to steal the workers' jobs. There are many sub-stories and revelations within this epic, far too many to relate tonight. The more we dig deeper and learn, we discover and celebrate the seeds of hope in that resilient workers and community struggle. What are seeds of hope? How's this? They're a story or a discovery that another world is possible. The mission of Battle of Homestead Foundation is to grow these seeds of hope by promoting a people's history, but also we work to empower today's workforce and build strategies for a future that benefits all working families and our nation. Our goal is to develop a regional center and institute for labor history and the future of work. 2 years ago, about this time, the COVID pandemic forced us all to change how we do this mission. Our public panels, historic commemorations, concerts, and drama are now presented online only. Publicity is generated with partners through social media. Even today, in the third year of COVID, the threat remains uncertain. Actually, we've discovered new opportunities to reach out, educate, fundraise, and organize. Today, the seeds of hope still sprout anew, even as our country faces major social, economic, and political crises. I need only mention the tragic racially motivated massacre of innocent shoppers in Buffalo to amplify the crisis. Not to mention other terrors. But crisis can also mean opportunity. Since November 3rd, 2020, we can begin to see a bit of light. We take heart and recognize the tremendous organizing by grassroots groups throughout the nation, many women-led, often in coalition with organized labor. This heroic effort was the engine that expanded the electorate, giving voice to millions of average working people. Thus was propelled the election defeat of a mendacious, anti-democratic president and his morally bankrupt enablers. But the hard-won progress is by no means assured to continue. Tonight, we again celebrate creative grassroots workplace organizing, alliance building, and people's history. We're optimistic about our mission as we see the growth of power for working women and men and their communities. So we say, come join us. More about our exciting upcoming programs in the wrap-up tonight. Now I'm delighted to give the mic to Mitch Troutman, a writer, educator, rural organizer, and jack of all trades. He's a direct descendant of bootleg coal miners, and a founder of the group Anthracite Unite. He currently lives in Pittsburgh. You can follow him on Instagram, Goodreads, or Facebook. Welcome, Mitch.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, this is great. This is the first time I've gotten to talk publicly about this book that I've been working on for years. So I'm really grateful to the Battle of Homestead people for making this happen. They are very organized and keep a lot of history alive in the state. And I don't know, I'm really impressed. So yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody who came, quote unquote, to Zoom. Yeah, so I'm jack of all trades. You know, I do a lot of different things for work. I'm not an academic, but I guess I'm officially a historian if I publish a history book, right? So I'm from Central PA, and I did not know I was the descendant of bootleg coal miners until I began researching this a while, which is a story you can read more about in the book. But let's see, the book is not out yet, and a few people have asked me, how did Battle of Homestead get a copy already? They got a digital copy. The print one, you get it when I get it, all right? Which you can pre-order a while now. You can also go to bootlegcoal.com, which is where I put blog posts, things that didn't fit into the book, any announcements like that. There's also a contact page. If you have questions that don't get answered here, you're welcome to contact me on there. Also, before I start talking about it, if we have any miners in here, say so in the chat. I'd like to know who you are. During the years of the Great Depression, the coal mines were closing down. They actually started before the Depression came on. And miners reverted to a tactic they had been using in strikes in the past, which was to just go dig their own coal off company lands. The United Mine Workers Union never said anything about it in previous strikes. It became pretty widespread though. But then the companies the collieries would reopen, they'd go back to work, and they were much happier working under safe conditions for decent money. But then when the collieries closed more permanently, they took in larger and larger numbers straight to the coal company grounds in their towns and started digging their own mines, usually using really primitive methods, but got really inventive with those methods. There were about 14,000 people doing it at its peak, right? And that's not just miners, but also people trucking the coal all the way from Connecticut to Baltimore selling it. And I guess I should say there's a big difference between bituminous coal and anthracite coal, which helps understand all this stuff, right? So bituminous coal, like out here in Western PA, look at the edge of this book. And the sides of the mountain, they kind of go in straight lines. Like when you pass by a cliff or something, you can see that. But when you go to central PA or northeastern Pennsylvania, the sides of the cliff look more like that, right? It was compacted and kind of squeezed like an accordion by the earth over millions of years, which purified the coal, made it harder, created anthracite. But it also means that the miners were often going vertical. And that has a lot to do with how all these methods worked and how they were able to get away with it. And it's also important to know that it was primarily used for home heating at the time, and still is. And so they were able to sell it directly, right? Bituminous coal miners in Western PA or elsewhere, that coal is getting sold to companies often. You probably wouldn't be a different situation. We'll just say that. So with that, I'm gonna Maura's gonna play a video for you guys. That's real footage from 1935. It was a newsreel film, and actually theaters were one of the industries that did great during the Great Depression because everybody was really desperate to just take a break from the world and watch the screens. And so that's the way a lot of people were getting their news, right? And so the March of Time did this 6-minute or so documentary that you'll see is extremely sympathetic to the bootleggers. And to let you know ahead of time, the footage is real. Some of the things are reenactments, but I don't know if they paid anybody, but the bootleggers who are reenacting are the bootleggers, and those are their lines. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that and let the video speak for itself. Oh, one last note, it is quiet, so please turn up your volume. Thank you.
The March of Time. In 6 small counties in Pennsylvania lie billions of tons of unmined coal. Almost all the anthracite in the United States today. For nearly 10 years, most of the mines have been shut down, their miners jobless. Yet today, the hard coal towns of Pennsylvania are not bankrupt. Stores stay open late. Cars crowd the streets. The mining people are decently dressed. Long before federal and state governments began handing out billions of dollars for relief, these people found a way to help themselves. What keeps them self-supporting is a continuous procession of motor trucks, rumbling day and night out of the mountains. In these trucks are thousands of tons of bootleg coal, stolen from the shut-down mines. When the mines began closing down 10 years ago, the miners lived on their savings, hoped for better times. As the abandoned collieries crumbled into ruins, the miners faced starvation. The companies let them pick over the waste heaps for coal to feed their home fires, to warm their children, and their churches to which they could no longer give money. Then the jobless miners started trading coal for life's necessities. When depression deepened, the miners went a step further.
Well, I got a new job now.
Yeah?
Yep, working for myself. $3 a day.
On their abandoned properties, companies posted trespass warnings. But the miners pushed past them, dug out coal from the hillsides, which they felt owed them a living. At first, they dug furtively. At night, they sold their stolen coal to local merchants who realized that this illegal coal business might keep families alive. Today, the business of stealing coal has become a community enterprise. 25,000 men, organized in crews of 4 to a dozen, using crude but effective homemade machinery, bring the coal to the surface. Other workers, young and old, prepare it for market, for sale in New York, Baltimore, Washington, as far north as Boston, for $2 or $3 less per ton than legally mined coal. Though the industry now grosses $50 million a year, the bootleggers firmly believe they are only taking what belongs to them. Time and again, to protect their properties, the mine owners order company police to drive the bootleggers from their workings.
Come first! Come first! Come! Well, how about it, fellas? You coming out of that peacefully? He says, how about it, fellas? All right, then. I warn you. The company means business this time. So do we, brother.
When the police fail and local courts refuse to interfere, the company sends men with dynamite to blast the bootleg holes. In defiant answer, the bootleggers sink their shafts deeper into the earth, into virgin seams of rich, gleaming anthracite, worth millions to the mine owners. When court action seriously threatens their business, the bootleg miners organize to fight it.
Men, we are going to fight this injunction to a finish. We are organized now. Our ours is as good as theirs, and so is our cause. Our grandfathers worked these hills, and so will we. If they try to put us off, we'll show them. What's going to be the signal, Chief? Or a blast of that fury whistle. When you hear it, come and fight for your cause.
Asked to mediate, journalist Joe Egor brings about an agreement between the bootleggers and the owners of one mine company. The bootleg chief agrees that his men will leave their holes when the owners promise to give them honest jobs. But this agreement affects only 350 men and 2 shafts. As the trucks of the 25,000 remaining bootleggers continue to rumble out of the hills, Pennsylvania waits to see if the Shamokin settlement will lead the way out of the most menacing industrial crisis in the United States today.
Okay. Mitch, are you ready?
Yep, let's go.
Cool. So I have prepared some questions for Mitch, and like we said earlier, if you have others as we're talking, please place them in the chat and we'll catch up to you later. So our last Battle of Homestead event last month was the murder of a Jewish radical, Herman Marius, in Erie in 1922. And this story was told in part through family stories. So I noticed in your introduction and then again in your conclusion, you talk about the importance of recording personal histories, especially navigating when those personal stories might not have been recorded and the holder of those stories pass away. Can you tell us about your research process uncovering and presenting these narratives about your own and other families, and how this might differ from like more traditional research, and how others could start their own process?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say, but when I started researching this, just out of my own curiosity, the bootleggers from this time were already passed away. And I thought I had hit a wall and there wasn't any farther I could go. You know, I had written this article, but then I kept digging on the advice of a friend and found that there was a man named Michael Kazora, who was the child of a bootleg trucker bootleg truckers from Minersville. And he was working on a book on this in the early 90s and had been interviewing the remaining living miners. But then he got in a car accident and died. But I tracked down his widow, who had saved all this stuff and was so happy, was hoping that one day somebody would get a hold of her and ask for it, right? And so that was like 40 audio cassettes of interviews with different people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that's what made this book, right? And I wrote it in a way, it's like, it is a history, but I have it told in their own words as much as possible. Partly because they tell a really good story, and sometimes it's really funny, it's really interesting, you know, and different people had different motives. So I'm not just summarizing things as this is how they felt, because they argued a lot and fought a lot amongst themselves. And so much of that comes out. And then I've also found a few other people, Van Wagner being one of them, who interviewed a bootlegger from this time before he died. And then George Corson, who was a folklorist, who's long passed, but he started the Pennsylvania Dutch Festival in Allentown, I think it is. Anyway, he had a few recordings that were in the Library of Congress too. And so really I started with those stories. And as I said before, at that point, I didn't know that my family had anything to do with it. My family's mostly Pennsylvania Dutch, and I grew up really close to the coal fields, but on the farm side of things. And I just assumed, I didn't even know there really had been Pennsylvania Dutch miners until I started digging into this, and turns out there were a lot of them too. And so it wasn't until I found some photos in an archive and showed them to my grandfather, my pappy, that he, you know, I had asked him about this before and it didn't come up. He didn't really have an answer. And then when I showed him a photo, he was like, oh yeah, my brother ran the hoist, you know, like da-da-da-da-da. He had things to say about the bootleg mine. It hadn't been in his context for so long, you know, that it really just hadn't come up and he hadn't been thinking about it. And I'm really glad to have found that. On the other side of my family, I found that a great grandfather was a bootleg miner, and I've never met this man. I honestly can't remember his name, but he wrote it on his draft card. You know, what's your occupation? Independent miner, right? Yeah, and so the stories that have been saved from this are really great and really fascinating. And it's also kind of tragic that this was such a huge thing, involves so many people, and there's so little of the history left of it, that I'm just really glad I'm able to save it. I was recently reading this book called Worn by Sophie Thornhauser, I think her name is. It's a history of like clothing, and she tries to document an important textile strike that happened in the South. And she went there and interviewed people, and the only answer she got was, we don't talk about that. That was a long time ago, and we do not talk about that, you know? And it's like that with a lot of things. I've come across other subjects while researching this that I wish had books on their own. The equalization movement, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But also there were a lot of bootleg truckers from Philadelphia and Baltimore who were Black who were involved that I really couldn't find much documentation on. I want to know so much more about that, but I wasn't able to find research leads. I scratched on like this whole issue with the KKK in the 1920s in the coal region, right? Because the KKK was very anti-union and anti-immigrant, things the miners very much were, you know? And there was real conflict there too, but I don't know. That's somebody else's book to write, I guess. But as for how other people can do this research, though, I think, like I said, like context, like things don't come up and then you don't remember to talk about them. They don't seem relevant to your life. Why would you bring them up? You know? And so reading national history and asking older people, like, hey, do you remember this? Like, did you have anything, like, where were you? Did you know anyone involved? And if you really want to go deep, if you go into newspaper archives, usually the issues between Christmas and the New Year will tell you like the biggest stories of the year locally, you know? And you can ask people like, were you around for any of that? You know? And it's surprising every time. Like, I would think that, okay, I have a narrative based on what I know. And then when I hear an actual individual story, it can be just so radically different, you know, like what was their perspective, how were they involved in it? There's actually some examples that I think are really good of this is if you've ever heard of the Foxfire series, I have this here. It's these oral histories that it started as a high school newspaper where they were just interviewing elders in the South about what life used to be like, what were their crafts and skills and lives like, you know, and it turned in like the high school newspaper became a larger newspaper, became a book, became I think 12 books, you know. So that's a really good example. And then there's also things we might not think of as much as history, but in the coal region, the anthracite coal region, central PA, northeastern PA, today there's been a lot of Latinos, especially Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans who have moved to the area. And it's the same thing where like, why did you move? You know, this isn't always a thing that they share with children, you know. Was it hard? Do you regret it? Like, how did you make that decision? What was it like to do that? And there's actually another book called We're Still Here by Jennifer Silva that interviews a lot of those people in the same area that the bootleggers were. So not just the coal region at large, but those specific counties, where she gives you the raw stories that aren't always that easy to read on that subject. But I think there's lots of history we miss by just going about our day, basically.
Yeah, that's cool that there's a high schoolers example, right? I guess we're out of excuses if high schoolers are doing it. We've got to get into it. You mentioned like some of these stories, right? Your grandpa saying we don't talk about that. And in chapter 1, you provide the context of the Molly Maguires in the region, which is something a lot of folks here are probably familiar with. Particularly about how they kind of became quiet miners. Do you draw any parallels to your process of gathering bootlegging history there?
Yeah, so like, I'm just going to assume that people here know the Molly Maguire's history a little bit, but labor unions didn't work. People may or may not have organized a conspiracy to assassinate mine owners. After a round of executions in 3 or 4 different counties, you know, that were used to take out labor activists, cultural activists among the Irish, right? We know that history now, but for the duration of the people who lived through that time, until they passed away, people didn't talk about it because that was a way to get you blacklisted from coal mining. You know, that was a way for you to lose your job. That was a way for you to incriminate yourself, you know? And so it was kept really quiet. And it was only after that generation finally passed that people really started talking about it openly again. And then Sean Connery's Molly Maguire's film from the 1970s also made it, you know, a public topic again. And it's interesting, there's, if you go to Gerardville, Pennsylvania, you can go to the Hibernian House, which is the same bar that the supposed leader of the Molly Maguires ran. And it's his great-grandson, Joseph Wayne, who runs it today, who I think says he is the only known descendant. But I think he also like looks pretty rigorously into anybody else's background that wants to say they're a descendant too. But yeah, I don't know. I find it kind of fascinating. But when it comes to bootlegging, they didn't hide it, you know, basically World War II put a stop to things because the economy picked up and young people got shipped out. But when the war ended again, a lot of people came back and started bootlegging again. And those skills and knowledge have passed down, and people like gradually the whole thing became legalized. By the 70s, there were no illegal miners anymore, but there were still people doing it the same way. They just had the right to do it on the property they were using. But in the audio interviews I talked about, there's one former bootleg union member who says, yeah, he kept paperwork on who paid dues, and he's burnt it since. You know, he doesn't want to incriminate anyone. There were multiple times where the miners surrounded and destroyed steam shovels or power shovels for strip mining. And yeah, they took it to the grave who it was that actually like lit the dynamite. you know? And then there's also the history with the communists. There were not a lot of communist bootleggers, but there were some. And they were pretty influential, even among people who disagreed with them, who were also bootleggers. And after World War II comes, you know, the McCarthy era. I mean, there was anti-communism before that, but especially after the war, you really did not want your name associated with that. And so much of the history lived on in terms of the skills and in terms of the attitude, you know, but a lot of the like gritty details of what did we actually do in the 1930s did not live on.
Yeah, well, you mentioned communism, and you talked more about communist organizing in the book. Point out Shamokin was a long way from Moscow in ways that, like, communist organizing doesn't have to be as by the book as some of the UMW stuff was. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah, so there were, I don't know, maybe 50 communists in the lower coal region at the time, like a 4 or 5 county area, who were, you know, they were miners, they were also communists. There were others who were socialists, you know, there were all sorts of different persuasions, but communism was like kind of popular among different ethnic European groups. And through the 1920s, they kind of followed marching orders, tried to set up a rival union to the UMW. It really didn't take, and they really weren't that well liked for doing it either. But come the 1930s, they got a lot more practical, we'll say. And there's a good comparison between Minersville and Shamokin, 2 towns out that way. So in Minersville, they said you weren't a good Lithuanian if you weren't a good communist, right? So that's just like how they organized things. That's who had the barbecues and birthday parties and all that, you know? But then in Shamokin, the communists who were there were much more by the book and also not well liked. They would go to, you know, if somebody organized a march for textile workers or mine workers, you know, they might go and like have chants about Russia and stuff, you know, and it really alienated people. And maybe one of the funniest examples is they were on a march in Mount Carmel, and which is near Shamokin, and they started chanting, you know, something about get rid of the mayor or whatever. And the rest of the miners around them were like, hold up, the mayor's a bootlegger. What are you talking about? You know, like, get out of here, do your research. Whereas again, in and around Minersville, the communists were some of the first to push for the bootleggers to form unions in the first place, you know? And then they remained in different levels in the leadership of the bootleggers unions, but they were never like communist controlled, you know? And actually at the time, the communists in the coal region were focused on organizing unemployed councils to, you know, try to stop evictions, keep people's utilities on and stuff like that. And so there was a lot of overlap between who was an unemployed bootleg miner and who was active in the unemployed councils, but there was no like formal crossover. But the Communist Party saw their project as doing the unemployed organizing and bootlegging. They were like, yeah, that's cool too. You know, we'll support our members or whatever. But another book, Steve Nelson, Steve Nelson, American Radical. He was a fairly high-level communist who spent like maybe half of a decade in the coal region, and his autobiography has like some really, I don't know, really astute things that he says about the bootleggers in there. So, yeah.
Awesome.
John Hare's buddies with his son.
Okay, so one of the things that was most exciting to me about the book, and I guess the history of bootleg coal in Pennsylvania in general, is sort of the do-it-yourself element. And so not only, you talk about how not only are the workers taking employment into their own hands, but they're like building their own equipment and creating their own collaborations to get the coal to market. Can you tell us more about that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So the the coal miners, what they were doing was pretty primitive. But again, like I said before about, I need a book again, about how the coal seams are like that in the anthracite, there's a lot of outcroppings. There's a lot of places where the coal comes like close to the surface, and you can figure out where that is, or maybe you already know because you worked in the mine that you're like above. And so they would dig their own holes going down in. I mean, there were other ways to do it too, but they really put to use every single thing you can think of. They were using like rain gutters and like rubber hose and stuff like that to run fresh air in. They were making fans by putting wooden planks on car engines, to force the air through. Or sometimes they lit a stove at the bottom of the mine and would use the heat. It would rise up, and that would draw draft in through another way, but that also caused mine fires, as you might imagine. They would link mine, like if everybody was working in the same seam next to each other, they would link their mines underground so that they could make one ventilation system for multiple mines. What else? I mean, the big thing, and that is on the cover of the book, is the auto hoist, and that was in the video too, where they would take an older car. This is like right after the Model T's, like not the most popular car anymore, right? And so there are a lot of Model T's around. They would take those, take a wheel off, turn it into a hoist, and use it to put it in drive to pull the cart up the mountain, and then put it in reverse to send it back down again to get loaded. 2x4 rails, but there was also a lot of theft. They would go into the old, like the closed mines, and steal anything they could: power wires, rails, buggies. And this was also around the time that the old trolley systems were being shut down, and so they were stealing all those rails too. There was a lot going on, but then more like socially, you could say, some places where there were a lot of bootleggers concentrated in one area, they'd hire a night watchman, they'd hire a mine inspector, like a bootleg mine inspector, to make sure the bootleg mines were operating safely. And then they had the truckers who were trucking the coal to most of the Northeast. And they had to make sales, they had to go door to door and figure out how to do that. And at first they were just literally going up to strangers' doors, knocking, you want some coal? It's cheap, right? Until they started building networks there, and people there started getting involved. And a fun thing about this to me, so there's still some independent miners out there, people who are in the same tradition. What they do is legal, but they're still using fairly primitive methods. A massive mine out in Wyoming, I don't know, they might get 100,000 tons a day or something, right? And one of these few existing mines in the Anthracite region today, that's the independent miners, they might have 3 guys working and pull out 6 tons a day, right? But so like those skills all live on, and some of those methods live on. But also it lives on in other ways, right? Like there's this guy I know who has a stake in a coal hole is how he'd say it. Like he has like a mine with some friends or relatives or whatever that he works once in a while. But he also built a helicopter out of parts, right? And if anybody's from Trevorton or around there, you probably know who I'm talking about. There's also a lot of the families in the area I grew up in that pretty much all descend from bootleg miners. There's a big racing scene where they build homemade trucks, right, and race them on the old mine lands. And a lot of that is there's so much inventiveness going on, and so much like sharing of like, oh yeah, if you take your shot leaf springs and you do this and that with them, you know what I mean? You get a better ride, like all sorts of things like that. And honestly, this isn't like unique to these people as a people either. This is like what farmers do and still do too. They improvise constantly. They use what's around. But it's really cool with the bootleggers to see it just go so large, so fast. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, while we're on the subject of talking about individual people, you make a point in your book to talk about individuals, to tell people stories like as in their own words, oftentimes. So can you tell us about, any of your favorites from the book?
Yeah, I originally wanted to tell this as a narrative history, right, where I would follow one person's story through the whole thing. And I couldn't find enough information about any one person to do that, right? I remember reading Warmth of Other Suns, right, by Isabel Wilkerson about the Great Migration of Black people moving from the South to the North. And she did a really great job of following like 4 specific families and their stories about how they got here. And yeah, I didn't have enough information to do that, but also I'm kind of glad. Like, it's great to read some of that stuff once in a while, but if every history were written that way, it would get a little tedious too. One person who I don't know enough about that I wish I knew more was this guy, Earl Humphreys. He was a miner who lost his leg, and then he was a constable for a little while. And then he became a bootleg miner, even though he only had one leg. And when they started forming bootleg unions, this guy lived in Shamokin. He was like the most trusted, and I don't know how that even works. I wish I knew how he got the respect of so many people who didn't otherwise normally get along. And so he was the first president of the Independent Miners Association, so the Bootleggers Union, and worked a few years without pay in that and just continuing to bootleg while doing it. I think he eventually took a stipend. And then I think he became a constable again. Anyway, I really wish I knew more about him. And I don't know, I was thinking about this, and there's a guy, Mitch Troutman, who I think is really fascinating. He was 14 when he started bootlegging. He went to school during the day and then would bootleg at night with his like brothers-in-laws, you know? And he was there, he witnessed a lot of what happened, but what makes Mooch really interesting is he becomes the IMA president later, like in the 70s, right? He's around for a long time. He's this well-known guy around Shamokin because it was infamously like when somebody got in a mine accident, he was going after you. You know, he was the first person people called. He also like ran this kind of grassroots campaign to close the old mine holes because there were hundreds of them, right? And their method, you know, definitely not up to standard today, but it was to drive cars right into them and then put soil on top of that, because if you just put the soil in, it would collapse. Anyway, his granddaughter has started a coffee shop in Shamokin called Bamsey that she has like a mini museum sort of to him. And also, if you've ever been to Knobel's amusement park, the mining museum, all that was Mooch Troutman's stuff. So.
Cool. In your conclusion of your book, you make the case that history is a weapon. And can you talk more about the limiting effects, what you call this national myth, that all of our ancestors are hardworking and they all followed rules, and how learning our history could empower those of us working today?
Yeah, it was hard to conclude this book because I put it in their own words as much as possible, and I didn't want to say, okay, this is what this all meant, right? There's a lot of things different people can take from this, and I'm really happy it comes out that way. But yeah, the main thing I could conclude is that when we forget this history, we really lose something by just assuming a generic history that applies to us. You know, it not only makes us forget who we are, but it makes us like makes us feel like kind of neutral observers to the world, which we're not, right? Like I wonder with the bootleg truckers from Baltimore who were Black, right? I wonder what it would be like if we remember our history and like maybe kept some of those ties alive, like when the Freddie Gray murder happened. You know, what would the response be? You know, if we still had communities like that, or if just we remember that, you know, yeah, like I'm speaking as someone who's a descendant, you know, like, yeah, our people had to like break the law, like brazenly out in the open, you know, talking to the newspapers about it and everything in order to survive. Like if I know that and then I see somebody on the news doing something desperate, you know, I mean, it gives me like a little bit of sympathy, if not solidarity, for people who, I don't know, say travel across borders because they have no other option but to break the law in order to not starve to death, right? It's the same thing the people of the Anthracite did. And I wish we, I really wish we kept those links alive. And I honestly don't think like the generic story of American history applies to really anybody's actual family. For instance, like the 1920s are known as the Roaring Twenties, but it really wasn't roaring for a lot of the country. You know, you might assume that it was, but a lot of people were in bad spots, especially in agriculture, textiles, coal, you know. So an example I did want to share, though, is from this group, Anthracite Unite, that I'm a part of. We run a blog and put all sorts of stuff up on there. And there's a piece called I Still Hear the Polkas that I really like. It's someone starts by reminiscing about their childhood, about how they grew up in a Polish neighborhood that was kind of segregated. And they remember polka being this constant background. They remember how at dances, it was often women dancing with each other because the men had black lung and couldn't keep up that kind of physical activity, you know? And how today, that same person lives in that same neighborhood, and today it's a Mexican neighborhood, and that mariachi sounds a whole lot like polka music to them. You know, I think that's so sweet. Another example is I mentioned how the Molly Maguire's bar, you can still go there. They also still have a chapter of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which is the organization that the coal barons tried to destroy, that the Mollies were supposedly a part of. And the AOH, Ancient Order of Hibernians, is like there's still some chapters throughout the country, also in Philly and some of the ethnic white neighborhoods. And the issue they primarily work on is illegal immigration and trying to help people get papers, you know? And I don't know, I think that's fascinating. And I think it's a good example of like, if we know who we are, how we can relate to the rest of the world. So.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about solidarity there, because that's a really huge theme in your book and in bootlegging in general. So can you talk about equalization attempts and how that worked in the process of bootlegging itself, and like community support and family rules, and like what's going on for communities here?
Yeah, sorry, my brain just slipped for a second there. I'm really glad that equalization got brought back up. It's like it's an important part about where the bootleggers come from. It was this movement at the same time as them in other parts of the anthracite fields, and I wish somebody else would write a whole book about that. But the book Face of Decline by Thomas Dublin and Walter Litch, they have done like the best job of anybody about getting this history of equalization down. And I followed every little step they did. I couldn't find anything new, you know? But basically, when the mines first started shutting down, it first became apparent like, oh, they're not about to open again. You know, something's different this time. The natural instinct of the union miners is to, okay, let's call a union meeting. What are we going to do about this? You know, and the idea that they came up with was we will equalize working time, right? If they cut 50% of the jobs, great. Then we all work 50% of the time so that we all have jobs. And in the northern fields, you know, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area, which was where the union was strong, the most members, basically the most members, the most mines. This led to like a civil war in the unions, which was brutal. Bob Walensky has a book about it called Anthracite Labor Wars. I think he's working on a sequel to it too. But there were assassinations, fights with bricks and lead pipes, baseball bats. There's like a story of like someone who was a scab, meaning they were just like with the union, one of the two unions, you know. They like filled up their when they died, they filled up their cemetery plot with trash so they couldn't be buried there, you know. And it ends with this the Good Friday bombing, which probably, I think there's other Good Friday bombings, but this one was targeted at some of the leaders of that. Anyway, a lot of people died. But in an area called the Panther Valley, which is like Tamaqua, it's kind of near Jim Thorpe, if anybody's ever been there. In that area, they pulled it off. They had to distance themselves from the union to do it. So they literally call union meetings and then say, motion to dismiss, great. All right, we are now having a meeting of the Panther Valley Equalization Committee, right? And community members would also come in and join them. And what they would do was just print like the newspaper, the local newspaper editor was in on it, part of it. Actually, he was the president of their association. And they would run working hours listed in the newspaper, right? How many hours has everybody worked in the past couple months? And as soon as it got out of balance, they just go on strike, right? Like if there were only, if it would take 10 hours a week for everybody to get work, right? Then the first group of people would go in for 10 hours and go on strike, say we're not opening again until everybody else gets their 10 hours. And they were able to enforce that through most of the Depression, which is amazing. But in the bootleg regions, the problem was there were just so many mine closings that it wasn't feasible. You know, there was nothing to equalize. And there's a lot of kind of sad but heartwarming stories of people who were like the lone member of their family still legally employed by a coal company, you know, and a lot of them would bootleg at night just to help their families, like not even to make the money, you know. And I think a lot of those people were fairly racked with like guilt, you know, at being the only ones who still like have union wages and union safety standards, you know. Yeah,
you talk a lot about how bootleggers get torn between their union loyalty and, you know, eating.
Yeah, because they really, really believed in the union, and that meant like a particular thing. This is before automatic dues deduction was a thing. Like you had to voluntarily give your money, you know, but they didn't see the union as an agency that employed them or something, you know. They saw it really as each other. And so it was tough. How do you bootleg? How do you steal coal from the company grounds? While also attempting to support and protect the people in the company's other colliery that's still running, you know, like how do you, it's amazing how long they managed to actually walk that line, you know, but in the end, there did end up being conflicts between, this is also the advent of large scale strip mining, right? And strip mining was very clearly putting people out of work quickly. And strip mining was also a way to destroy the bootleggers by destroying the entrances to all their mines, you know? And there were a lot of like 1940 to 42, there were a lot of standoffs between various groups. You know, don't open that until you open this. Don't strip there until you employ these people, right? Yeah.
We're going to blow up your shovel.
Yeah, well, so then the other side of it, yeah, is that the union miners like super supported the bootleggers, and if the bootleggers wanted to call a strike on a working colliery, then the UMW miners would usually honor it. You know, like if they were trying to okay, so say you have Reading Anthracite. And in one town, you have a working colliery, and then you also have bootleggers over here, right? The company threatens to kick out the bootleggers, the colliery goes on strike, you know? So it shuts down their production either way. And yeah, that amount of solidarity is, I don't even know what to say about it. You know, it was really hard to write about because of how profound it is. But it's sort of more of a community feeling, not like a personal feeling, and not just like one action or anything. You know?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from those stories. I'm going to move to questions from the chat. So we have two questions about organized crime. Mark and Dan are both sharing that they have some family history in the region, and they have heard stories of organized crime from their families. Can you talk more about any insights on that?
I know the Walensky families have written a lot about organized crime in the Anthracite region. What's remarkable with the bootleggers is that organized crime wasn't really involved. The best theory that they came up with at the time was that organized crime was scared of them, but I think it was more that organized crime was really based out of Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, and Pittston, and really tied into the textile industry, especially with its relations to New York City. but to the best of my ability, I was not able to find any links between organized crime and bootlegging, unless you consider bootlegging organized crime, which it is. So that's fair, but it's not. wasn't the mafia, you know. But that's the best answer I can give you.
Sure. Mary Ann wants to know if you've ever been in a bootleg mine.
Mary Ann is my mom, and that seems like a setup. Two winters ago, some of the remaining independents took me down into their mine and I just like worked for them for a day to see how things operate, you know. And honestly, you know, like coal, it's like not the future. We really should leave it in the ground. But I also really respect what they do and the risks that they take. And it was really fun work. And after that, I was like kind of itching for a week. Like, I don't know, maybe I should just quit what I'm doing and go do that, you know? Because it was very satisfying, but it was like so much skill and handed down knowledge that it's really clear that if all the independents stopped today and new people tried to come mine, they just wouldn't be able to. There's just so many tricks and like precautions and procedures and different things, you know, that they've learned over 150 years that are mostly stored in their minds.
That seems like a softball question from your mom. We'll go for harder hitting ones. Perry Recker wants to know, why did the companies close in the first place? What were the economic reasons? What were the names of some of the companies? Is there any chance at finding more stories from the company side?
Yeah, so I didn't spend too much time looking for like company narrative on this. Viewing it as a people's history, I was really just interested in the miner's perspective. But I did try to dig into it though, and I have a chapter about the financial actions behind all of this, right? And it was interlocking directorate is what it was called, where the top 10 producing anthracite coal companies were all owned by the same people. And Pennsylvania did a report where they tried to map out their connections, and it's like this crazy spiderweb looking thing. But the largest was Reading Anthracite and Hudson Coal. Hudson Coal goes in Wilkes-Barre, Scranton. Reading Anthracite is in the lower coal region, and it's like the main company that the bootleggers had issue with. And it was also the largest landowning company. Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company was the one in Panther Valley where the equalization campaign took place. But so why did this happen? That is controversial. Because the saying forever has been like, oh, the miners wanted too much, and then it made coal too expensive, and then oil just took over, you know? But it doesn't quite line up like that. It was more disinvestment or divestment, right? Where the companies had their assets, right? They had these coal mines and they're worth so much, but every year they're operating, they're getting like worth less and less and less. And so what they try to do is withdraw as much money as possible while maintaining the monopoly on the land so that others couldn't come in and compete with them, right? And they were at the same time investing a lot of that money into, there was a lot of shady bookkeeping, and basically a lot of the money was being sent to the railroads to make it look like all the coal companies were failing, to shift the profits onto the railroads so that they could later sell off the companies. And just weird stuff happened with who bought the companies to control the assets. It's a whole, I don't know. I wrote it in the book, and it was a tough chapter to write, why I believe this happened. And oil was definitely like, you don't got to take out the ashes. You don't have to shovel it in. It isn't gonna, well, most likely it's not gonna give you carbon monoxide poisoning. You know, you don't have to poke the furnace like two, 3 times a day, right? There's a lot of reasons oil was better, but during the Great Depression, it was still more expensive, and also the cost of installing a whole new heating system in your house was pretty wild, you know? So it really hadn't made that much of inroads yet, but the writing on like the larger wall was clear. You know, World War I happened, and World War I wasn't fueled by coal, it was fueled by oil. So.
Cool. Your mom is asking, what coal company was in Shamokin?
Well, there were quite a few, but Reading Anthracite was the biggest one. Stevens was also in there, that they were mostly subleasing from Reading Anthracite. There was a Susquehanna company. Yeah, there were some others. I don't know all of them off the top of my head. There were 10 large coal companies, and then there were 30 to 50 companies who ran maybe one colliery or so in the coal region.
Michelle mentions concern about coal dust in miners' lungs, I think, during the video. Can you talk more about black lung or anything, any health effects?
Yeah. Interestingly, black lung, I mean, it was bad, but it got worse when machinery got mechanized, right? And this is before that. So the bootleggers were definitely running the risk in getting black lung from mining for long periods of time. And they have fought like hell for black lung benefits like after that, you know? This man, David A. Lanick, who was king of the bootleggers was his name, who passed away recently, but he spent a lot of his life fighting to get older miners black lung benefits, even if they had been doing illegal mining to get it. Yeah, that's what I'll say. But when again, when like pneumatic drills and stuff like that came in, that's when the dust particles got a lot finer. Which isn't to say they weren't getting it, because they definitely were. But
okay, we have an anonymous question. As you look at America today, do you see any economic sector where worker-controlled production enterprise like Bootleg Coal Rebellion could succeed on a wide scale, a type of wide-scale cooperative that could challenge the private corporation dominating a sector?
When you get the answer, anonymous, please tell me. I mean, I've been thinking about that for years. Like, how could this apply like one-to-one to other people, you know? And I've like looked into the question internationally, and internationally the answer is mining. But beyond that, I don't know. Yeah. But if you tell me the answer, I'm ready to start working on it. So.
Yeah. We have a couple folks who identified themselves as descendants of bootleggers. One of them is George, I think from Schuylkill County, who is asking about if you spoke to anyone in Schuylkill County. And I wonder if you want to hear more from any descendants, or if you have anything to speak to with them.
I mean, the fun thing is, if you live in Schuylkill County, there's a high percentage chance that you're a descendant, you know? Like, I didn't know that I was, and once I looked into it, once I started looking at these records, if you're from any of these towns and you've been there for 3 generations, you're probably a descendant. Schuylkill County, yeah. I mean, almost all my research was done in Northumberland and Schuylkill counties, and so a lot of the interviews are from Schuylkill County. I see you're asking about New Philly specifically, though. I don't think I have an interview with anybody from New Philly, but
yeah, Megan Parker also has a great-grandfather, and his brothers were bootleggers in Schuylkill County. And then Mark says, my uncle was a bootleg miner outside of Minersville.
Actually, there is one thing I want to talk to descendants about, which is getting some historical markers set up. So if anybody's interested in working on that in their town, I would be very happy to work with you on the process, on the fundraising, on finding like specific events and sites that happened in a given town. I would love to do that.
Well, Mitch, thanks so much. We worked through all the questions. So unless anyone has any other ones, or if you have questions for anyone.
Well, if anybody has other questions, they can go to the bootlegcoal.com website and contact me and ask me directly. Yeah. Oh, I'm also looking for if anybody wants to work with me to set up an event. This is the first event. It's Zoom, so anybody can come, but I really want to do as many in-person events as I can, especially in that region.
John, I think we're ready for you.
Mitch, why don't you just say when the book is coming out soon,
September,
I think, so people can know.
September 16th is the release date, but if you pre-order it, you should have it before that.
Do we have an event here?
Thank you. I actually have a question. Was there something comparable in the bituminous region at all? I never realized, but your discussion reminded me that my father, who grew up on a farm in Indiana County, told me the only way he could pay for college was when his father promised the college 2 railroad cars full of coal from the mine they had on the farm.
Wow.
And it appeared as if there still are some of the, it wasn't a deep shaft mine, I don't believe, but it was, they would go into the hillside to get the coal, and many farms had it too.
Now that's a story. I have not heard of anything in bituminous mines. I've tried to look into it, but if something happened, it probably wasn't on this scale, and they also might have called it something different or done it at a different time. So I haven't been able to figure that out. But that said, this bootleg coal, I think it was mentioned, I think it got one sentence mentioned in People's History of the U.S., and so if anybody before this had just been wondering, you'd say, oh, it probably wasn't too big of a thing, So for all I know, it could have been twice as big, same thing at the same time, and I just have no idea. So
We've got to ask all of our ancestors. That's what we're supposed to be doing, John.
Mitchell and Maura, I think this is a fantastic example of people's history. And it's precisely, I believe, what spurs us on to become fascinated with what parallels we see from back then and today. Helps us to understand sometimes the fights that we're fighting today were fought before in a little different grounds, a little different conditions. But the reality is that when people are facing desperate times, they do their best to try to work together to find a way out of it. And this is a wonderful example, and it shows that we don't always need developed organizations to build the solidarity that is important. We need organizations to do that. We need organizations to be able to help communicate, to be able to help focus among all of us in different areas. But if you don't have at the base the enthusiasm, the understanding, and the energy, you don't really have a movement. You can't build it with fundraising activities out of Washington, D.C. or somewhere else. It's built where the people are working. So thank you very much, Mitch, for the energy that you've taken and the interest that you've taken in doing this, and for sharing it with us.
Tell them about the White Whale Bookstore.
I want to ask people, if you haven't yet, to join the Battle of Homestead Foundation. This is what we're all about. All you have to do is check our website, push a couple buttons, give us your PayPal or credit card donation. Dues are $20 or $10 for students and retirees. They're annual dues. Did you know that once you join and you receive your Battle of Homestead Foundation member card, it automatically provides you free admission to you up to a party of 4 to the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, and the Western Pennsylvania Sports Museum. They're affiliated with it. Also, the Fort Pitt Museum down at the Point. Also, the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and Historic Village, a wonderful place to go in Washington County. After you join us, I hope you will consider also a tax-deductible contribution to our organization. We've been in existence for 25 years. We have no dedicated paid staff. We are primarily a volunteer organization, although we hire people as independent consultants to do projects from time to time when we have the resources. But we are engaging in projects such that the recording from this program tonight is going to be available on the website. We have a YouTube channel. It'll be a tremendous educational resource for other folks that want to do these kind of things. And for those that have been to our other programs, I think you'll find a large variety of important resource information that we hope are going to form really the treasure chest for the center that we want to see built for labor history and here in the Steel Valley of Western Pennsylvania. So please join up. We'd love to have you, and we'd love to have your energy and your interest and work together to continue to reach out and learn together. What's coming up is, I hope, of interest to you. On Wednesday, July the 6th, Battle of Homestead Foundation is sponsoring a morning meetup, and it's our first in-person meeting in 2.5 years. And it's at the Pump House, the historic Pump House in Homestead, the only remaining building from the 1892 times of the Carnegie Steel. Most of it was destroyed by the Homestead Steel plant that existed there. But at that meetup, we are going to commemorate the 130th anniversary of the 1892 Battle of Homestead. And about 7 or 8 folks are going to speak for about 5 minutes each in the morning in a more informal setting. There'll be light refreshments. If you come at 9:30, there'll just be informal exchange until about 10:15 or so, and then we'll have a chaired session. And we'll also try to have this to be a hybrid meeting where we will offer a Zoom link to those folks that can't make it. We're still contemplating how to do this best and technically best, but that's our intention. And we hope you will come and commemorate together with us the battle that happened right there on the river's edge, the Mon River's edge, at the Pump House. And in August 11th, Thursday, August 11th, our program will focus on labor and the environment. We're going to focus on people who work in the mill at Clairton, the coke works at Clairton, and we're going to talk about pollution, and we're going to talk about environmentalism, and we're going to talk about that from the perspective of the people that work there and the people that are demanding to be able to breathe clean air. And it's not an easy discussion, but it's one that is so important to all of our communities. So we hope that you will tune in and find out some more about it. The details are to be announced, and again, you're going to check our website for that. I know it's been put in the chat here, but that's going to be Thursday, August the 11th, and also. On Saturday, September 17th, there will be a one-time live performance where Battle of Homestead is the producer of a performance of a musical by the musical organizer Cy Khan called Mother Jones in Heaven. It's a one-person, really a two-person presentation about Mother Jones. I know you'll love it. This is a ticketed event. It's going to be at Henry Heyman Theater at University of Pittsburgh. Tickets are $25, and you'll see a lot more about this in your emails if you sign up to get our emails on the web. So those are events that are coming up that I wanted to tell you about. I again offer my thanks to all the participants who have been on tonight. I know it's hard to be a listener, and unfortunately, when we do things on Zoom, it's difficult to fully open up a group meeting. But we hope you take this as our invitation to do so in other ways with us. Okay, and there isn't one thing that you could be thinking about or one question that you might have that wouldn't be important or relevant to us. So again, thank you, participants, for coming. I ran across a quote that I read in a obituary for the very interesting anthropologist David Graeber, who recently passed away. He wrote a book with archaeologist David Wingrove. That's a fantastic book called The Future of Everything. David Graeber was the person who invented the phrase, we are the 99%, during the Occupy movement, although he claims that he didn't invent that particularly. It was a result of a committee discussion. But in recognition of his contributions, his co-writer, David Wingrove, this is the book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, David Graeber, David Wingrove. David talks about how when you look back and you study and you discover new ideas and you realize and you look around that this isn't what we've been taught, or why have we never found this information before, or isn't it amazing we've been able to uncover something that puts a different slant on what we're thinking. He said, another world is possible. And if you believe that, that's what keeps you going. And here's the sentence that I found really meaningful. We've reached the stage of history where we have scientists and activists agreeing our prevailing system is putting us and our planet on a course of real catastrophe. To find yourself paralyzed with your horizons closed off by false perspectives on human possibilities based on a mythological conception of history is not a great place to be. And that's another way, I hope you get the message, which of saying we can build a better world. And it didn't have to have turned out the way it did in the past. If we can just find out what'll make the difference the next time. So thanks a lot, everybody. I really appreciate your participation, and we'll see you next time. And let's try to keep the solidarity going, and the communication and the education continuing. Take care and good night.